What I find on these events, and I hope that you find them too, is that there's a very positive atmosphere. People leave fizzing and buzzing and overwhelmed at times, and very moved and stirred and energized. Often when we get here, the energy can be a bit buzzy, a bit overexcited, little bit frivolous even at times, but it settles at some point, and I feel at some point the atmosphere deepens and people start to be affected by that. And they leave having had a taste of something very positive, a new way of being with people perhaps, and possibly even a taste of what life could really be like, what human communication could really be like, what human society could really be like. And then what we see is we go into the normal world where things are not quite like that, where different values obtain, where different forms of communication obtain. And often people are very struck by the kind of contrast of that. Sometimes we have to warn people about crash landing from retreats and being back in the normal world. Obviously people's circumstances differ greatly. Some people are fortunate enough to live in retreat centres and such like, but for many of us there's quite a strong contrast between the kind of life we live when we go on retreat, the kind of communication we can expect when we go on retreat, and what we normally expect from the world. So retreats of this kind, and of many other kinds, can show us a more ideal way of living life. We could call it a kind of a model for a better world, a new kind of world. Sangharakshita gave a talk in 1976 in which he talked about this, and he allowed himself to dream about what a new kind of world of this kind would be. And I'm going to give you a quote from him because he expresses himself very beautifully. The new world will be a world of individuals, a world in which people relate to one another as individuals, a world in which one is, a world in which one will be free to develop to the utmost of one's potential, and in which all the social, the economic, and even political arrangements will help one to do that, to develop, to grow. The new world, therefore, is what we call a spiritual community. A spiritual community writ large. And our aim, therefore, must be to transform this world, the present world, the old world, into a spiritual community. Because this is the only new world which is worth having, the only new world that is worth working for. And as Pranikato mentioned yesterday, he embodied this idea, this ideal in his poem, The Four Gifts. And he gave us the metaphor that the spiritual community is a garden planted in the wilderness. We dropped the planted for the sake of the title because we thought it sounded catchy, but our theme for the weekend is a garden in the wilderness. Gardens tend to be planted, so maybe that word is a bit superfluous actually. But so the garden is the spiritual community, the garden in the wilderness. And that begs the question, what is the wilderness? And in Sangharakshita's thought, the wilderness is what he calls the group. The spiritual community consists of individuals. Now, we need to be a bit careful with this term individual these days. Subhuti thinks it's become a bit dangerous. Our society in the West tends to emphasize the subjective over the collective to such a high degree that the term individual has a danger of having that connotation. So we need to be careful that we observe Sangharakshita's meaning of it. An individual is someone who is fully self-responsible, self-aware, creative, and living according to higher values. And he relates to others on that basis. relates to other people as individuals, as people at least who can potentially function in that sort of way and inhabit that sort of state of mind. So he distinguishes this from the individualist, someone who merely defines themselves in relation to or in contradiction to conventional values without necessarily transcending them. And the group is what human society looks like outside the spiritual community, and it's what defines most of human relationships. Within the spiritual community, people relate as individuals on the basis of love. In the group, people relate largely on the basis of self-interest. The group is characterized by a sort of uneasy truce of mutual self-interest. In the group, people don't fully think things through for themselves. They tend to accept the attitudes and the belief systems that they inherit from the group that help the group to cohere in mutual self-interest. So that's what we're trying to move away from and trying to develop society out of. We're trying to make a transition from the group to the spiritual community. But there's another important category, and that's what Sangharakshita calls the positive group. So when individuals come together, they form spiritual communities. The spiritual community then can begin to start influencing the group. And if it influences it enough, it becomes a positive group. A positive group is still a group. It still has some degree of sort of self-interested identification. But it's a group that started to be influenced more and more by the values of the spiritual community, the values of love and generosity and awareness and those kinds of things, all of the things that probably attracted us to Buddhism. The positive group is not to be underestimated. We can see a very, very powerful example of the positive group in India, where I've just returned from. 60 years ago, some of you will know this because it's been emphasized a lot in the Triratna Buddhist community recently. 60 years ago, a great political leader in India called Dr. Ambedkar, political leader and leader of the oppressed classes in India, converted to Buddhism to escape the oppression of the Hindu caste system. He converted initially with something like 400,000 people, and within a few months of him doing that, there were almost 1 million people newly converted to Buddhism. 60 years later, there's something like 30 million people. Many of these people don't know a great deal about Buddhism. For many of them, it's not really an individual spiritual commitment. But even so, it's had a huge effect on their lives. The Ambedkarite Buddhists of India have transformed their situation socially, economically, out of all proportion to anyone who was in an equivalent sort of position 60 years ago. This shows the power of the positive group. Merely a change of identity, of group identity, from being in an oppressed position in the caste system to refusing to accept that label, that identity, has had a huge effect on the lives of millions of people. And seeing this for himself has affected Sangharakshita's thinking on the relationship between the Dharma and society very profoundly. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of the positive group. The positive group allows for the emergence of a spiritual community, and in fact it encourages it. Without a positive group, it's very difficult for a spiritual community to sustain itself, because it's constantly working against the pressure of the group, which sort of draws people back into it. Group attitudes die very hard indeed. This is one of Sangharakshita's aphorisms. Individuals who can really sustain a spiritual awareness, creative commitment to higher values, in the face of social conditions that really do not support it, are very rare indeed. And we shouldn't underestimate this. So we need to recognize the influence that the social conditions that we surround ourselves with have upon our lives. We have another very powerful example of this in the young people's movement, actually. I got involved with the True Atna Buddhist community when I was actually young. I was once actually young, and I was 18 when I got involved. And probably for about the first at least 5 years, if not more, I was the youngest Buddhist I knew. There was hardly anyone around. The few of you who've been around that long will know what I'm talking about. There wasn't any of this. There weren't young people's groups. There was hardly any young people coming to our centres. All of my friends, pretty much, who were Buddhists, which was most of them, because I dropped all my old weed-smoking friends when I got involved in the movement. All of them were 10, 15, 20, even 30 years older than me for most of my early years of involvement, including most of my training for ordination. Well, how things have changed and how quickly they've changed. It's been extraordinary. It's only 8 years, and we've drastically, radically affected the demographic of the movement. And this has now started paying dividends in terms of the people getting ordained. A lot of the people who stood up to announce themselves as order members last night have been ordained in the last year, or just this year. I don't know, it seemed to be about half of them as far as I could see. I think this is a direct consequence of the young people's movement. And this is a result of creating a positive group, basically. People need peer support. We have a natural desire to interact with people our own age who share our our stage of life. And if we can't do that with people who share our values too, then that will inevitably hold us back, almost inevitably anyway. People like, where's Dharma Shalin? Me and Dharma Shalin seems to have managed it without the support of the young people's movement. Singamati too, wherever she is. The others wouldn't have stood a chance. Kusala Sara would have been all right because she's my sister, so she would have had my example. By the way, I've been aware for about a year that I was going to give this talk, and that joke was one of the first things I thought of. So, I thought it went reasonably well. You can let me know what you thought later. But they tell me that jokes, help people to concentrate while I'm doing theoretical expositions and things like that. You may have one or two jokes later on. I'll see how bored you look. Whether I can manage a story, I don't know. So what we're looking to do is effect a transition. The sort of ideal transition is from group to positive group to spiritual community. The transition from group to positive group starts to happen as soon as the group starts to be influenced to whatever extent by higher values. Values that encourage and affirm the importance of the individual and their growth as an individual. But the spiritual community takes that further than the positive group. And in the spiritual community, there is a high level of individuality, a high level of self-awareness, of creative self-responsibility, that sort of thing. That's the ideal progression. So probably some of you know this sort of teaching. It's quite a significant aspect of Sangharakshita's presentation of the Dharma. I think it's one of his most brilliant contributions, actually. But now I'm going to progress to something that's a little less well known. So if you think you know it all and you're already beginning to drift off, it's time to prick your ears up and listen. The people who've been on the Dharma courses will have heard me banging on about this a lot, so you can stop listening if you like. Sangharakshita, casting his penetrative gaze over the history of Buddhism, has seen that Buddhist movements come and go, and they tend to follow a particular pattern. First of all, there's the stage of what he calls inspiration. This is when an outstanding teacher arises and teaches the Dharma directly from his own experience. Obviously, the most outstanding example of this is the Buddha himself. He searched for the truth. He studied under the teachers who were around at the time. We don't exactly know what form this took. The sort of traditional accounts of the Buddha's life are very often mythologized, but this is probably sort of what happened. He would have explored what was available in the Indian religious scene of the time, and he found it to be wanting. He found it to be lacking, and he made the greatest breakthrough that any human being has ever made, at least from a Buddhist point of view. And then he taught. And he didn't teach a theory, he didn't teach a system, he didn't teach a philosophy. He taught the Dharma directly from his experience, from his inspiration. Sangharakshita calls this phase dogmatic, even. He doesn't mean it in the pejorative sense of being irrationally, aggressively assertive. He meant not rationally worked out. It's just a statement about the nature of things, a direct communication about the way things really are. This is what a great teacher is capable of, the Buddha above all. And some people will respond to that directly themselves. Some people will have a glimpse of the truth of the Dharma for themselves. They then become independent of the teacher's dispensation, in a phrase from the Pali Canon. In a sense, they don't need a system of ideas to guide them anymore. Once your experience of the Dharma is deep enough and real enough, direct enough, you're guided by that. You're independent. But what if you don't get that far? Well, then you still need ideas, and you still need a system of training. And then the next stage in this process becomes necessary, and this is what Sangharakshita calls crystallization, the stage of crystallization. So this is when the teaching of a great teacher starts to sort of form into a pattern of spiritual life and spiritual training. And that pattern governs the spiritual efforts of the people belonging to that school or that movement, that tradition. And if it's an effective pattern, it helps them to move towards a direct realization of the Dharma. Unfortunately, this has a danger, which is it can degenerate into what Sangharakshita calls scholasticism. This is when the sort of pattern, the crystallization, becomes an end in itself. It stops to serve the purpose of moving people towards a direct realization of the Dharma, and merely becomes a kind of an object of inquiry, of scholarly inquiry. Actually, it's broader than merely to do with scholarship. It can apply to all aspects of practice, this kind of degeneration. So in the crystallization phase, you need to have a system of meditation practice, something that really helps people to develop. But if that isn't moving you towards direct experience of inspiration, then it becomes merely a collection of techniques. And I'm afraid there's quite a lot of meditation in the world that's really techniquism. It's not to do with deep transformation. Something like ritual. The idea of ritual is to connect us deeply with our values and to motivate us towards the goal of spiritual life. But if we fall away from that, it becomes just a sort of, at best, religious formalism, or even, in some cases, superstition. And teachings and ideologies, philosophies, they can just become a basis for sectarian division, or people with nothing better to do spilling ink over how many angels fit on a pinhead and that sort of thing, which apparently is something that actually happened in the Christian sort of scholarly tradition. It sounds unbelievable, but that's what I heard. Am I speaking too quietly again? Oh dear, okay. Wave your hand if this keeps happening. It keeps happening. And then there are institutions. Movements tend to form themselves into institutions. And the danger with institutions is that they stop to serve the end for which they were originally created and become merely a matter of sort of preserving hierarchies for their own sake and people's privileged place in oppressive systems. So this pattern of inspiration, crystallization, and degeneration into scholasticism is something that Sangharakshita recognizes as having happened again and again within the Buddhist tradition. It's a sort of a natural phenomenon, a natural sort of law of history, you could say. And it's something that has happened to us as well. Bhante was in somewhat a similar equivalent position to the Buddha. When he came back to the UK in 1964, he tried to involve himself in the Buddhist scene of the time, and he found it wanting. He found it pretty unimpressive. It tended to take one of two forms. Either it was an attempt to transplant a traditional form of Buddhism in its entirety onto English soil, or it was a sort of fairly bookish, dilettantish, non-sectarian interest in things Buddhist, with maybe a bit of meditation sprinkled in, but certainly nothing so decadent as performing a ritual or chanting or anything like that. So if we're to use our metaphor of a garden in the wilderness as being a true spiritual community, it occurs to me that the first example is like trying to get a kind of a tropical plant and plant it in an English garden, in which case it requires highly artificial conditions in actually to keep it alive. The other one's more like reading a book on botany, but without having much intention of actually making a garden. So this is what Sangharakshita found, and he found the Buddhist scene of the time pretty unimpressive, and decided, partly, well, he was uninvited, and at that point he realized that something new was needed, and that's what he started. Now, when he started the True Ratna Buddhist community in 1967, he didn't have a carefully worked out system of ideas, sort of institutional arrangements. He just taught. He started teaching. His teaching started taking particular forms over time. He taught from his own creativity, his inspiration. And, over a long teaching career, he's developed a very rich body of material. It's a lifetime's work, really, just to know and understand the teaching that Sangharakshita has himself produced. But gradually that had to take a particular system. It had to move into the crystallization phase. Otherwise, what do we do? What do we actually do with this teaching? We need something that's going to guide our spiritual efforts throughout our spiritual lives. So we formed systems of spiritual discipline, for example, or he formed them. And he formed an institution, and that's the order. The order and what was then called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. So, this is a process that's still under development, in a way. This Sangharakshita has taught us directly from his inspiration, but he's also started the process of forming a system of training that's going to be effective for us in the modern world. And this is developed into what we now call the True Ratna Buddhist community. At its core, it has an order of people committed to the particular perspective on the Dharma that Sangharakshita has given us. So you may think that I'm now going to exhort you to join the order or something like that. I'm not going to do so. But what I want to communicate to you is the importance of having one. So any effective crystallization of the Dharma needs a core of people committed to that crystallization, to that particular perspective. We can't be Buddhists in general, if you see what I mean. You need to do something in particular with your spiritual practice. The Buddhist tradition is vast. It's bewilderingly vast. Even the material from the Buddha himself, from the Pali Canon, is more than any one individual can really get hold of, let alone all of the sort of subsequent developments. But what we need is someone to look at the Buddhist tradition synoptically and say, okay, here's what you need. Here's something that will work for you. Here's a way it all coheres. Here's some principles that can govern your life. Here's a way of looking at the entire Buddhist tradition. And here's a set of practices, of ideas that will effectively move you towards a direct understanding of the Dharma. So we need a committed core in order to keep that alive. If we don't, if there isn't a sufficient commitment to a sort of a core body of material and a shared approach, then our movement will gradually fall apart. And also, you need a commitment in your life. Every Buddhist does. It's very, very few people can sort of look at a spiritual supermarket and find for themselves what is needed. It takes a really exceptional human being to do that. If you are one, then good luck to you. I'm not. I needed someone to have done the hard work for me, really. It really takes a sort of genius to do that. And I think that Sangharakshita is one. I don't think he's perfect. He said himself that he's never considered himself the best person to found an order in the way that he has. But he's a genius. He really is. I think he's going to be remembered as one of the great figures of the 20th century, certainly within the Buddhist world. And he's only over there. So it's, it's about 200 meters away, something like that. He's probably, what's the time? He's probably having his mid-morning nap. Well, I hope he is, because he's not been sleeping very well. So I hope he's managing to do that. So he's done what the great figures of the past have done. He's done exactly the same as, Vasubandhu, Gampopa, people like this, the founders of the great schools. He's looked at what was available at the time. He's decided that something new was needed. And he's put together a sort of package of teachings, not fixed, not set in stone, very flexible and open actually, but a package of teachings, a perspective on the Dharma that can serve as a unifying factor in a spiritual community. So I invite you to take this seriously and to explore this perspective that he's given us as deeply as you can. I don't want people joining the order or asking to join the order on the basis of a sort of fizz of enthusiasm. I certainly don't want them joining it because they want to become Dharma teachers, for example, because ordination's not a sort of badge of a teaching certificate. It's definitely not a badge of spiritual attainment, and it's not a kind of gateway into institutional privilege. I'm not saying that those things won't come into one's experience of the order. They inevitably will, because human beings are imperfect, and our order's imperfect. But it's not ultimately what it's about. What it's about is commitment to a perspective on the Dharma, a way of practicing and understanding the Dharma, which will move, ideally, if it's an effective one, and I believe ours is, that will move us towards a state of true spiritual community, a state in which we've kind of let go of our attachment to group identities and are able fully to relate to one another as individuals. Sangharakshita has said that in order for commitment to be deep, in a way it has to be narrow. And he also said on another occasion that we should be broad in our sympathies and narrow in our commitments. So what he means is that one needs to commit to something in particular if you're going to get anywhere with the spiritual life. It's no good trying to do the biggest range of spiritual practices from the entire Buddhist tradition that you can. You won't go very deeply into any of them. Subhuti uses a lovely metaphor. He says it's like you're trying to get water from a well. If you drop the bucket halfway down a dozen wells, you won't get any water. If you drop it all the way down one well, then you will get some water. The particular well that we're offering within the True Ratna Buddhist community may or may not suit you. There are other wells available. I think we're a good one. I've tried it and it seems to be working, but that's only to the limited extent to which I've actually managed to commit myself to it. But a commitment is necessary if you want to progress in a spiritual life. How far you take this is entirely up to you. Some people say, okay, I like these people, I like this community, but I don't want to take it any further. And you're welcome. We extend you the hand of friendship nonetheless. Even if you're not a Buddhist, it's fine. You can come to our centres, you can meditate with us. If you decide you like meditating but actually you're a Sikh, no problem. However, you can't join the order because there has to be a sufficient overlap within the core of a spiritual community, overlap of perspective, in order for it to hold together. You may decide to become a mitra, which means that you've decided that this spiritual community is your spiritual home. And that may or may not involve a sort of an intention to commit more deeply to the Dharma and to this particular order. Again, it's up to you, and it's not that there should never, ever be any sort of pressure on anyone to take commitment to any particular level. So I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. I'm trying to sort of encourage an understanding of what I see as the truth of the matter, which is that a spiritual community needs a core of committed people. And individuals who want to go further with their spiritual life need a particular spiritual commitment. And that our community offers a kind of system of training. And I invite you to take that system seriously and explore it. Think about it for yourself, question it and examine it, and decide whether it's going to work for you, whether it's going to give you what you need in your spiritual life. Only on the basis of really examining it can you decide whether it's going to work, and can you form an opinion about our spiritual community. Sometimes I think people have criticisms of our community without having really understood what it is. So you hear that people, they like the fact that men and women seem to get on rather well in our community. The relations between the genders are in general very positive, but they don't like the idea of single-sex activities, for example. They don't necessarily understand that there might be a connection between these two factors. Which is what I mean. They like meditating with us, but they wish we'd stop going on about spiritual friendship all the time, and spending so much time drinking coffee, talking about our lives or whatever. They like the sort of the atmosphere, the friendly atmosphere at our Buddhist centres or whatever. But they don't like all this emphasis on Sangharakshita. It seems a bit culty or something like that. Without realising that the friendly atmosphere is because we've got such outstanding Dharma teaching, especially on the nature of Sangha. And this comes from one man's spiritual vision. You get the idea. You need to see the system of ideas and training as a whole. It coheres. It sort of it makes complete sense. I'm not saying it's perfect and that we're not open to criticism and even amendment, but this needs to be done on a sort of awareness of the rationale behind these ideas. So I invite you to take us seriously, to take our community seriously, to take this particular sort of flowering of a garden in the wilderness seriously. Take Bhante seriously, Bhante Sangharakshita, and examine his teachings carefully. And take yourselves seriously. Young people can aim high. We can be ambitious. We don't need to be sort of frivolous and fun all the time just because we go to young people's groups. Sangharakshita had published his magnum opus when he was younger than me. The Survey of Buddhism came out when he was in his early 30s. Schopenhauer wrote his main work when he was 32, something like that. So I've got a bit of catching up to do, frankly. Keats died when he was 26, and now he's recognised as one of the greatest poets in the English language. Singamanis will tell me that Rimbaud wrote all of his poetry before the age of 21. So young people can be serious in intention, and you can take yourself seriously as being able to do something with your life. Whether that involves commitment to the True Ratna Buddhist community is another matter. There's many ways of living a good life. There's many ways of making flowers, gardens bloom in the wilderness. But this is one way. I think it's a good way, and I invite you to explore that. Now, our Sangha, it doesn't just need people to commit and to provide a committed core. It needs young people to do so, I'm afraid. So, again, without sort of wanting to persuade you of anything, unless some of us do, our Sangha will not survive. It was recognised as quite a big problem 8 or so years ago that not many young people were coming to our centres, and therefore not many were asking for ordination. If only young people ask for ordination, only older people ask for ordination and train in ordination, we'll only get older members. Young people will stop being attracted to our centre, and gradually our Sangha will die. So yes, unless this does happen, and unless enough young people start taking this seriously, and I know some of you do, our Sangha will gradually degenerate. We will degenerate anyway, one day. It's okay. Well, it's sort of not, but it's inevitable. This is, again, it's a law of history. Sanghas come and go. Spiritual communities come into being. They endure for a while. They change society, even if it's only on a small scale, and sometimes it happens on a very big scale. And that endures for a while. Things improve. People gain enlightenment. Civilizations are created, and then that dies away. When I was in India, I was fortunate enough to go to the Ajanta caves. Who else? Was anyone there? Yeah? Singamanis has been there, I know, one or two others. It's extraordinary. It's wonderful. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. It's a 2,000-year-old cave complex that arose at the height of the sort of Buddhist civilization in India. It's astonishingly beautiful, intricate carvings and frescoes painted on the walls of these 26 caves carved into a rock face in this river valley. So it shows what a Buddhist civilization is really like, what Buddhist values, influencing society on a very wide scale over a long period of time. It shows what it can produce. That is what is possible. Again, it died away, as everything does in this impermanent world of ours. But we want our community to be part of creating that sort of culture, where we're not just a small little subset of English, generally lower middle class sort of alternative spirituality, where we're reaching into many different communities, creating a much broader movement that influences the world on a much bigger scale at a time when it desperately needs it. So the survival of our Sangha is not guaranteed. It depends on the commitment of its members. And it does depend on enough young people choosing to commit to a sort of deeper training. So what might you do? Suppose you did want to work in this garden in the wilderness. What might that look like? Well, there are many options, actually. There are many ways to tend a garden. The first thing I'd say is you don't actually need to do anything at all. If you work in this garden, you don't even need to work. You can just come and enjoy the garden. Hopefully you're enjoying it a bit already. But as true spiritual community develops, it becomes its own reward. It doesn't have to justify itself, real spiritual community. Spiritual community is the aim and the end of human life. There's nothing beyond that in a way. There's just a deepening intimacy of spiritually aware people. This is actually what life is for. So if you find that, to whatever extent, then just enjoy it. You don't need to justify that. It's not a stepping stone to picking up litter or something else that's better than that. It is the most wonderful thing in existence, is being part of a spiritual community, communicating with other spiritually committed people. Without that just sort of mutual delight in spiritual community, a spiritual community is dead anyway. It ceases to be a spiritual community. The institutions through which spiritual community expresses itself are secondary. They're necessary and useful, but secondary. And they can even start to become a hindrance when that sort of living spirit of communication between spiritually committed individuals is lost. However, there are ways that one can actually think of working in this garden as well. So you can tend the plants, for example. You can, say, work at a centre or help at a centre. You can help to keep the centre more beautiful. You can help to welcome people into the garden and show them where the most beautiful roses are, or whatever. You may even think about the possibility of teaching. Now, I'm a little tentative about this. I'm quite hostile to the idea of people becoming teachers. Being a teacher, especially a spiritual teacher, can just be another trap for the ego. It can just sort of degenerate into sort of guru culture. It's very easy to sort of project onto big people with big followings and such like. I don't want to encourage a sort of motivation to that sort of status-oriented approach. But we do need people who are willing to teach. And that doesn't mean you've got to be particularly talented. It doesn't mean you've got to be especially articulate. There might be certain ways in which you can teach in which you're effective and certain ways in which you're not. But I think most people can teach effectively. And sometimes it doesn't take that much. And if you do, if you're willing to put yourself in those circumstances, you will change people's lives. I'm sure anyone who's done any teaching at Dharma centres, any of the order members, will know what I'm talking about. I remember teaching a course at the Birmingham Buddhist Centre a few years ago. And I think it was the second or third week, a woman who I hadn't really spoken to came up to me and said, "This has changed my life." And I was thinking, well, I didn't do anything. I just told her that she was responsible for her mental state. And she said it transformed her relationship with her colleagues at work, for example. The Dharma is not complicated. What people need to hear is a simple and clear presentation of it, and they need to see people exemplifying it. That's what people need. That's the only requirement to be a Dharma teacher, really. You need a clear enough understanding of the principles, and you need to be making a sincere effort to practice it in your life. If you can do that, then you can communicate the Dharma. And if you do communicate the Dharma, you will be instrumental in radically changing people's perspective on the world. In a way, it's not about you. It's not something that we should become egotistically attached to. This is why I'm against sort of teacher identities. When we teach, we're passing on the wisdom of the tradition. It doesn't come from us. It's not our understanding, in a sense. We should do it with humility and a sense of reverence and of the preciousness of what we're giving people. Another thing we need is people who are willing to pioneer. So most of the world consists of wilderness. The pockets of garden are few and far between. The task of transforming the world from a group into spiritual community is endless and vast. Probably it will never be done, but we try and do as much of it as we possibly can. Now, yes, we need to look after the patches of garden that we have managed to create, such as they are, imperfect though they might be. We need to concentrate on maintaining those gardens, making sure that they remain beautiful, making sure that people can find their way in, they know where the gate is. But also, we need people who are willing, who have the courage, the resourcefulness that's needed to go to places where there is no garden. Machete in one hand and rose bush in the other. There is so much scope for practicing, especially in the kind of cultural climate that we're in which we're still, as a movement, we're still growing. We're growing, and I think there's plenty of sign that there's plenty more growth to be done. I don't think there's a sign that we're anywhere close to beginning to decline as a community. The world is a big place, and the True Ratna Buddhist community's sort of perspective on the Dharma seems to be so much needed, so well appreciated when it does take hold. So think about that. Don't be afraid of being a little ambitious or being a bit excited about the possibility of doing something drastic and radical with your life. There shouldn't be any sense that it's all been done. That in our community the work has been done, and all that's left for you to do is go to Mitra study once a week or whatever it is. There's so much scope for creativity, for innovation, for courage. And yeah, there are many areas in which this is needed. There are many centres, even in the UK, there's cities that don't have Dharma centres, and throughout the world there are situations that are hungry for the Dharma, waiting for the Dharma, that don't have it. That can only happen on the basis of being sufficiently well trained in the Dharma. We need to sort of keep a balance between spread and, gosh, not putting this very well. We can't spread too fast and too far. We also need to work on our sort of coherence at a core, if you see what I mean. Otherwise, we'll just spread out and become diffuse. People who are in outlying situations, pioneering the Dharma, need to make sure they're properly trained and need to make sure that they're plugged into a wider context. Otherwise, they'll get isolated, and that's potentially quite dangerous. One thing I think we desperately need is businesses. We desperately need Buddhist businesses. I think this is one of the most urgent things that the True Ratna Buddhist community needs. An aspect of Sangharakshita's presentation of the Dharma is team-based right livelihood. We're not a monastic model. We are not dependent on the support of a laity. Sangharakshita wanted to move away from that model. He came to see it as deeply problematic. What that means is we need to generate our own funds. And one way to do that is to form businesses. And at the moment, there is a serious shortage of them. This cannot be, it can't be the case that it's not possible to practice team-based right livelihood in the modern world. So teams of Buddhists working together, practicing together, and trying to make money to devote to our movement is a really wonderful aspect of Bhante's teaching, but one that needs to go much further, and that needs people with ideas, creativity, to bring to bear on that problem or this issue. So there's just a few ideas of things you might like to do or to think about, ways that you can contribute to our spiritual community. You don't need to sort of decide now which of them you find most appealing, and they're not exactly mutually exclusive either. We're not a sort of a place where you choose a career and and then pursue it for the rest of your order life. At its core, we're a spiritual community of committed individuals. That's what our movement is about. And all these other paths are ways in which you can contribute to the expansion of that. So whether this appeals to you or not, whether you want to practice in our community or you decide that there's another path that you prefer. That's up to you as free individuals capable of thinking things through for yourself and making a choice. But whatever you choose, I hope that, I hope you enjoy this weekend. I hope it gives you a taste of what a different kind of world could be. And I hope that, at least to some extent, you will want to contribute to making this garden in the wilderness bloom ever more fully into the future. Thank you.